Women's Heritage Center. I'm here today with Ruth Scriven-Wolf, a person who has been long involved in community activities, school activities, and has made a huge impact to the state of Maryland. So welcome, Ruth. We're really happy to talk with you today.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about how you got started with your school system activities.
I just became very active in PTA, which back in those days was a very active group. I had 4 kids in school.
When you were involved early on with the PTAs, what were some of the school system issues that you were dealing with?
Well, the one that received the most attention in the press and public discussion was school desegregation, but there were many others. There was an issue about how far handicapped children had to travel to get to their classrooms.
This is special ed legislation then.
Yeah.
Right. So what was your role in some of the desegregation activities?
My role, at first I met, and this name will sound familiar to you, with Leon Panetta, who was then a Republican and worked for the Nixon administration in what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. They were threatening to withdraw Prince George's County's federal funds for not complying with the law.
When you were getting involved in that, were those schools where your children were those schools desegregated or not yet?
No, they were totally segregated, and 2 of my children were the first white children in what had been the black high school, the only one in the county, and one of the few black junior high schools.
And how would you compare the traditionally white school with the traditionally black or African American school at that time?
Well, I think the simplest way was what my daughter's reaction was, it's just a question of money, Mom. The facilities were even though the school system had put hundreds of thousands of dollars into the school before they sent any white students there, my daughter felt that it was very obvious how neglected they had been financially.
Some parents, I'm sure at that time, elected to not send their children to a different school because they were afraid of the disparity in educational opportunities. I mean, what was going through your head at that point, and how did you have to decide where your children would go to school or not go to school?
Well, you're right. There was a tremendous amount. Many parents sent their children to private school, used an excuse to get transferred to another school. I guess my main reaction was, I wish I had caller ID on my phone, because you'd be surprised how many very threatening and nasty phone calls I got.
And you were getting these threatening calls because you were promoting school desegregation?
Yes. It was the law. I had felt, this was 1972, the court decision was 54. Our schools were still totally segregated. And I felt it was high time we obeyed the law.
That is a big gap in time, isn't it?
It was, school systems in southern Maryland were totally integrated by then, and most schools around the country were.
Right, and I started teaching in '73 in Howard County, and I think Howard County just kind of started out that way because it was a new community. But it's amazing that in that short amount of time, that it was so recent in our past that schools were still desegregated.
My kids still are amazed at the social change, not just in school desegregation, but other social issues, at how rapidly we have changed socially.
And I know that your children are all adults now. Did their experience in segregated, or what had been segregated schools, did that negatively impact their education or their employment outcomes now?
It certainly didn't seem to. I know, well, my youngest son, who was the first among the first white students to go to the class, is an attorney now, and I have arguing case before the Supreme Court. My daughter graduated from college cum laude and ended up teaching herself and just retired.
So some of the fears that other parents had about going to schools that had been traditionally segregated kind of didn't work out in terms of what they were afraid of for most students.
I don't think any of them worked out, and I think all the students who transferred gained a lot, both in not just in education, but in standing up for what was right to do. And I had, years later, I had students call me and tell me that, and I had other students call me whose parents had transferred them to a private school and tell me, do you realize all my parents taught me by doing that was to evade problems and not face them? So it was a learning experience.
Of course, it was a very challenging time for lots of areas.
Now my daughter, when riding to school on the bus, faced a lot of criticism from her schoolmates, blaming her and telling her it was all her fault. They were having to do this and so forth.
Right, it's all their mothers doing.
Yeah,
right?
But you know, what did that do? It made her have a spine of steel.
Well, I understand also that not that you were finished with the PTAs, but you moved on, you also were very active in the hospitals in Calvert County.
Well, that was later. I mean, this issue was when we lived in Prince George's County. After all my kids were through school, or in college, we moved to Calvert County, and I was very active. It was a very, very rural county then, and I started a hospice, which I felt was badly needed. And
what precipitated that? I mean, I know you thought it was badly needed. Was there something personal that one of your friends or relatives needed hospice care?
No.
Or just it was a gap in services?
There was a gap in services. There had been a study of the service gaps, and that was one of the major ones. And it took a little doing, but I had a friend who was another friend who was a nurse, and she had a husband who was very civic-minded, and she borrowed $5,000 from him, and that was how we started.
Grassroots.
Yes.
From the bottom up, that's great.
Right, and their budget now, I think, is $350,000 a year.
You planted quite a seed, didn't you? Well, you know, you've always been kind of a mover and shaker. You would see a need and you'd make something happen. So, did that come from something that you learned from your parents? Did that come from something you learned during the war years? I mean, where did all this spunk come from?
I honestly don't know. I was in the Army during World War II, a nurse, and I was stationed in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And of course the military was then segregated, which wasn't very obvious in a hospital.
Right.
But if I went into town, Tuscaloosa just
Tough place.
was not my kind of place, let's put it that way. It just raised the hair on the back of my head. And I don't know if that was the impetus. I really don't know. I just felt things had to change.
Did you ever serve overseas as part of the Army?
No, I never did.
Okay.
Never got further away than Tuscaloosa.
Yeah. And how did your family feel when you enlisted, obviously? So how did they feel when you enlisted to be in the Army at that time?
Well, my husband was overseas, and his only fear was he would be coming home when I would be going overseas.
So the reverse deploy, right.
And but fortunately, the war was over before that happened.
Good, that's amazing. I know that the Women's Heritage Center talks a lot about some of the women that were in the military, and many of those jobs or those roles were pretty much invisible until more recently. What were some of the other things that you were a nurse, but still, I'm sure you interacted with other Army women. What were some of the jobs that they had, or did you interact with some of them?
No, the hospital was a world unto itself.
Okay.
We really did not interact very much. And there were, I don't recall any female veterans
At that time. Right.
So,
right. And then when you came back from the Army, were you employed as a nurse then?
yes, we lived in Syracuse, New York for a while, and I was an operating room supervisor at the University Hospital.
So you didn't have any trouble getting your job back or a good job back
no.
from the military, because you were in the medical and nursing field,
Yeah.
right? Well, talk to me. Did you grow up in Syracuse?
No, grew up on Long Island, New York.
In New York. When did you move to Maryland?
My husband's job brought him here.
So, as you moved to Maryland, which was obviously a new state, what were some of the things that you really liked about living in Maryland, or some of the other challenges that you saw?
Well, of course, the school issue was the major one, and we had lived in between in Oregon and Arkansas before we moved to Maryland, so I was kind of glad to get somewhat settled. We moved 11 times the first 8 years we were married, so that was my main thing.
To have a new home and roots here.
Okay, now I'm settled, and that's where we raised our children.
Well, talk to us a little bit more too about some of the work you may have done around other places in Maryland, or in terms of supporting women or women's history areas.
Well, I was chairperson of the local hospital, and for a while, and our CEO was a wonderful man, but somewhat of a chauvinist.
Oh, somewhat, right? Yeah.
And I think we taught him a few things. He has just recently retired. He was in that job for a long time, and as I say, was an excellent CEO, but he needed some learning.
Right. So since we're talking about leadership, how would you describe your leadership style, and how did that work for you?
I'm not even conscious of what it was, to tell you the truth. I just did what I seemed to feel had to be done.
Okay, so it's a matter of getting the job done?
Yeah.
Right? How would you describe how do you like best to communicate with people?
I like to talk to them. I email, I talk on the phone.
Sure.
Just anything.
Sure. So like when there was conflict, let's say when you were working with the desegregation, how did you handle some of those really tough, conflicted situations?
I was more worried about how my kids were handling them than I was how I was handling them. They faced some pretty rough times, and it was mostly a question of supporting them and making sure they were okay.
I imagine you had some really interesting conversations around the dinner table about how was your day at school,
Yes.
Can you remember one of those examples?
Well, I can remember very well, and I was driving my youngest son to college, and he said to me, "I will be so glad to get away." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Mom, I'm so sick of hearing politics discussed at the dinner table. I would," and he went on at some length, and I said, "I'm sorry, why didn't you butt in with your own thoughts?" He said, "Well, I tried, but it didn't always work, because my issues were never very important compared to the rest of," he had 2 older brothers and an older sister. He was rather sat upon, but it didn't really take.
So, here it is, 2015, and we're still struggling with some of the issues of equality and economic equity and all those kinds of things. From your experience in a broad range, both in working with desegregation in the schools and working with getting services to cover some of the community gaps, what would you say to other leaders now in terms of how they should handle improving the situation, getting along better with other people, or understanding the needs of other people? What are some of the lessons learned maybe that you had that you would share with sort of the contemporary leadership now?
I think the most important is personal contact between people. I think we have to learn on many levels to really treat people equally.
Well, you know, we've those of us who have worked in gender equity have done a lot of teacher training, but that's the thing that comes back to it all the time. Most of the time teachers don't know what they do. It's not intentional, but it's the unintended consequences that's still the challenge. That I think we heard some of that in Baltimore recently too, that the students are feeling the same way. So did you have, when the schools were about to be desegregated, was there a lot of teacher training or orientation, or just kind of it just happened?
Well, there was some.
Some.
There wasn't a great deal because there wasn't a great deal of time. The general population was sure that the court would never order this to happen. And the court did order it, and they ordered it to happen, and this, I think, was a wise decision, in the middle of a school year. At the semester break. And the reason I think it was a wise decision was, although the school system was pushing for not starting till the following school year, I was concerned that if they did that, the students would be home for the whole summer, and there would be chaos. And the other thing that I was concerned about was demonstrations in September. And the order went into effect the end of January, and I think it's going to be nice and cold, and there's going to be no parents out there protesting.
And what happened? Were there any parents?
No, there were
none.
no
So it just sort of slipped under the...
Everything went very, very peacefully. There were some wonderful church and other groups like the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which had asked permission to patrol what could have been problem schools, and nothing happened. And I made a motion at the next school board meeting that we write and thank those organizations, and I couldn't even get that motion to thank people passed.
Why?
There was that much antagonism on the board.
That's tough.
When you won't write a thank you, I think that's pretty safe.
We've been talking with Ruth Wolf, and we were just about to talk about your family a little bit, and maybe some anecdotes about members of your family and how they impacted your growing up and some of your leadership as you got older.
Well, there's one incident I remember very well. My father died when I was 8, and I have snippets of memory, but one is crystal clear in my mind. My sister and I were staying with relatives while my mother and father went on a weekend vacation or something. I don't remember the details. But when my father came to pick us up at the relative's house, they had in those days, I won't use the word, but they had a Negro maid. And she had been very, very kind to my sister and I. And so when we were saying goodbye, I gave her a hug and a kiss goodbye.
Sure.
And I could feel you know how you can feel somebody's disapproval? And I could feel my father stiffening and frowning, and he said nothing, but when we got in the car, I said, "Daddy, I can know you did not like my kissing Anna goodbye. What did I do wrong?" And he said, "You did nothing wrong, but I was raised in the South, and my perception," he probably didn't use that word, but my reaction is different. My reaction is wrong, and you did the right thing, and I was very proud of you." I know that little episode had a decided effect on me, especially since my father died not too long after that.
What an important message he gave you.
Yes.
Very important message that stuck with you, obviously.
Well, it stuck with me all these years, and That was many, many years
Do
ago.
your children know that story?
I'm not sure they do. I don't.
Yeah, I'm sure you've got lots of stories that you need to tell them because it's amazing how that, even as you were what, 8 then? How old were you? About 8? Powerful message. It also says to us that people can change, they can change their opinions, they can grow, and I think particularly as we're looking at some of the changes and community building we still have to do, people have to grow and change as well.
Yes, and it can be done, even though it's very hard to change your reaction. You can change your mind, and my father certainly had, and you're right, it had a tremendous impact on me.
You've mentioned a little bit before about, like your youngest son was kind of sick of talking about politics at the dinner table and so on. And I know one of your older children is a lawyer and had a chance to argue before the Supreme Court.
No, it's the same son.
Oh, the
Oddly
same son.
Enough, yes, yes.
The one that hates politics was now arguing before the Supreme Court.
Yes, he discovered when he got to college that political science was not so awful. As a matter of fact,
so the dinner table was again another catalyst.
He called me once and he said, "Mom, I'm thinking of changing my major." His major then was marine biology, which was ridiculous because he's a terrible mathematician and therefore could not really be a scientist. But I said, "Oh, that's interesting, Richard. What are you going to change to?" He said, "Well, I think political science. You know, that's really interesting and it's kind of easy."
Right. So I understand you got to see him in the Supreme Court chamber. So
yes.
Tell us about that.
When you are arguing a case, you're assigned so many seats. Regular tourists are sort of brought in and out on something like 20 minutes, but we were able to, the family had seats and were able to stay through the whole argument. And it was what I did not really understand the reason the Supreme Court took the case, because it was, to me, an unimportant issue, was whether the mother of the defendant, my son only does capital murder cases, and his main objective is to prevent somebody from being executed. He does not believe in the death penalty. And he was arguing this case, and the issue was whether the mother could testify in the penalty phase. And somehow, and I was very impressed with all the judges. They all asked pertinent and appropriate questions.
That's good to
They
hear.
were well briefed, or they read it all. I don't know which, but they were all except Justice Thomas, who never asked questions. But Justice Scalia asked my son something about the Eighth Amendment, and Richard said to him, rather, I thought snobbily, but I was proud of him, "Justice Scalia, I have never mentioned the Eighth Amendment. It doesn't apply." I had to come home and look up the Eighth Amendment. When he said that to Justice Scalia, I wanted to jump up and applaud, but I did not. I behaved myself. You're not allowed to take photographs of the Supreme Court. So there are a group of young men, or I suppose women, who offer to, for a price, paint the scene for you. And my son had that done, and the picture is hanging on my wall, and I'm very proud of it.
So
and he painted himself into the picture.
Right. So your son, as well as your daughter, learned a lot about politics and leadership from the dining room table, sounds like.
Oh, yes.
Right. So if you had another message to your daughter or to other young women in terms of leadership styles, what might you say to them?
Don't be afraid to speak up. And learn to speak so people can hear you. If you're in an organization, learn the rules.
Do your homework, right?
Parliamentary procedure, whatever the rules of the organization are, learn them, and then you can use them to your advantage.
Can you give us an example of how you may have done that?
I'm trying to think.
Either in your school system jobs or...
Well, many times let me switch from school system. I was also, later in my career, I was chairperson of the Maryland Hospital Association. And we were debating what the pension should be for staff, how we should fund the pensions, what the relative pension should be, and so forth. And I remember having to raise a point of order and use some parliamentary procedure, and got the issue discussed. And I was not chairperson then, I was vice chair, and at the end of the meeting the chairman said something to me about, complimented you're a good lawyer. I said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a nurse.
Right.
I thought he was going to...
So you knew how to use the procedures appropriately and to get your message across.
Yes. And you know, not be out of line, but maybe push that line a little bit.
So I imagine your credibility went up then too, because you could clearly show that you knew your stuff.
Yeah.
And again, your point got taken well, and I assume that they voted in your favor?
Yes.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, but the chairman at that point said, all this time I thought you were a lawyer.
That's a
From
compliment.
him, that was a compliment.
That was a compliment.
Not everybody would have thought it a compliment,
Right.
but he was a lawyer.
We've talked about your children, and I also see here that you have a number of grandchildren.
I have 8 grandchildren.
8 grandchildren.
And 8 great-grandchildren.
And are they people that like school and did well in school for the most part?
I have a daughter who was a teacher. She just retired. My daughter-in-law, who is very, very dear to me, and I've known her since she was 14, was and still is a teacher. Now she's a teacher mentor for the state school system. And so they're all interested in education.
Any interested in politics or political science? Not
yet. They're not, and I'm surprised that well, to some extent I'm not surprised, because they felt they had their fill of politics.
Of it. Right.
My husband was very, very active in politics and worked for the Senate. And
as staff or as a volunteer?
As a staff.
As staff, okay.
And again, you know, that's why the discussion around the dining room table was always political.
Ruth, we've had some really exciting stories to tell us. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your 2 older adult children?
Well, during the time of desegregation, my second oldest son was dating the daughter of the main opponent to school desegregation, Mr. Nick Ennie. And the reporters got wind of this. Reporters are very good at their jobs.
Right, they are.
And they came to me for confirmation. And I've never lied to a reporter, even through the worst of times. And I said, yeah, it was true, but it would mortify the kids if they read it. They were sick enough of seeing their parents' names on the paper. Please don't print the story. And I appreciated the fact that they never did.
That says a lot to you, that they listened to you, which is great.
My son and my daughter, Mr. Ennie's daughter, have since married, have 2 children, so
you probably saved your marriage, right? And you still got desegregation in Prince George's County, which is good.
Yeah, but it did not, it should have happened so much earlier, and it should have been so much smoother if it had happened earlier. And if the school board had control over how it happened, since it was all in court, and the court mandated when, how, and
yeah, people hate mandates, right?
It was just never accepted and caused white plate. My oldest son, Terry, was during the Vietnam War a in the Navy Air Reserve, and they discovered he had a very acute hearing, so he did a lot of work in detecting submarines by flying over the ocean. Weird what technology does. He has since retired and lives his life stream because he's living on a golf course.
That's great.
And he really
Well, he did his
enjoys it.
service in the Navy and had a career, right? All those good things. Well, Ruth, it's been wonderful having a chance to talk with you about part of her story, which was a very important part of Maryland's history. And is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up today? Anything we forgot to talk about?
I think you've covered everything. As I say, I just wish the school desegregation had happened more smoothly.
But you were there to put it back on course. So we thank you for that, and Maryland thanks you for that. Thanks again, and thank you for being with us at Herstory.